Okay, thank you, everybody. We're getting back to our Gemara on Daf Mem Daled Amud Beis 44b on the sheets I sent out, really towards the top of the page. I apologize if you hear some drilling coming from the neighborhood. I can't dampen that anymore. We were discussing, and we have been discussing already for a few weeks, this strange mitzvah of Arava. There's almost as much material on this mitzvah than there is on Lulav and Esrog, despite the fact that it plays such a small part in the mitzvah of Sukkah that we have today, and the mitzvah of Arba Minim. Of course, we're talking about this special mitzvah of Arava, not the mitzvah of the Arava within the Lulav bundle, but rather the separate mitzvah that was carried out in a very different way in the Beis HaMikdash, and which was being carried on in some form today. Last week, we went through some Gemaras and some very interesting tangents, really, on those Gemaras. But the Gemara concluded that the original mitzvah of the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash was halacha l'Moshe miSinai. That had Torah force as a Sinaitic tradition. And that was just the mitzvah in the Beis HaMikdash. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, there was also a ceremony of Arava, which we keep some pale vestige of today on Hoshana Rabbah. But that was either we had the discussion of this, was it a Yesod HaNeviim or was it a Minhag Neviim? Now, if you've been following the Shiurim over the last few weeks, you should be by now, hopefully, thoroughly confused because we've gone through so many variants before and after the Beis HaMikdash, inside the Beis HaMikdash, outside it. How was the ceremony carried out? What was the source? Was it a posuk? Was it halacha l'Moshe miSinai? What exactly was the content of the mitzvah? All of these variables being discussed in recent weeks, and I myself are also thoroughly confused as to where we've reached. We've almost, it seemed, are unable to understand where we are today in relation to what came before, and really what were the details of what came before. So for my own purposes, I put together a little table which I'm going to share with you. It's a chart, and if I go through this chart, I'm hoping that you will be able to, I'm not sure what that signal was, that you'll be able to become up to date with me as to where the Gemara stands. And this is really a summary of the variant positions and the variant combinations in relation to the mitzvah of Arava. I've set it up this way. I've written it myself, and I hope it's correct. No guarantees. I haven't seen it in the art scroll or anything like that. And so it's not halacha l'Moshe miSinai. This is just my own understanding. So here, this is the mitzvah of that Arava. If I go through it with you, I hope it'll flesh out again really quite a lot of the Gemaras that we covered before, but which seem to have got lost and left us in a state of confusion. What I've done is I've created two columns, and there are two rows. So there's a column here of in the temple, what actually took place in the Beis HaMikdash, when the Beis HaMikdash was around. And then what there is outside the temple. If you were not in the Beis HaMikdash, the ceremony was a bit different. And then there are two time episodes. There's during the temple, here we see over here, which will be the rows, what happened during the temple times when the Beis HaMikdash was around, and then after the Chorban HaBayis, after the temple. So essentially there are four boxes, and one of the boxes isn't really occupied at all because after the temple, in the temple doesn't exist. There's no such thing. If a temple isn't around, there is no temple to be in. But there are three boxes which I've populated with details, and they differ from each other. And this is based upon the various Gemaras that we learned over the last few weeks. So let me start with this, which is, if you like, the top left box. During the temple and in the temple. excuse me, I'm not going to take this. During the temple, in the temple, when the Beis HaMikdash existed, inside the Beis HaMikdash, which means if you were in the Beis HaMikdash and not outside it, then the halacha of the Arava, this mitzvah, was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That's just what I mentioned a few moments ago. It was a Sinaitic tradition which carries Torah force, and that's very important. It's not a rabbinical enactment, it carries Torah force, even though it's not in the scripture itself, as halacha l'Moshe Sinai carries the same force of requirement to carry out the mitzvah as if it were in the text itself. Again, under these circumstances in the Beis HaMikdash, it was a 7-day mitzvah. That is, the Arava ceremony took place every day. That ceremony included large Aravot. Do you remember I've shown you this picture several times of these huge Aravot that were carried around the Mizbeach, the altar, and then erected against the side. So as I've said over here, what was done? It was carried, it was waved, and erected around the altar. We had these large overhanging Aravot. So that's in the temple during the temple. Now, if you were during temple times, but you were outside the temple, so you were in Rechavia, which isn't quite in the temple. Some people think it's, the same as the temple, but it isn't. Or you were in any other town, but you were just not in the walls of the old Yerushalayim. Then there was also a ceremony that you might call Arava, but it was a pale version of it, and it was not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It was either Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im, and we discussed this last week. It had a different force than if you were in the temple. This only has, if you like, a rabbinical force or less. If you were not in the Beis HaMikdash, there was an enactment or a minhag initiated by the late prophets, Chagi, Zachariah, etc., to carry on some pale form of it, even though you were not in the Beis HaMikdash. But it was one day only, what today would be the Lahashana Rabbah, the last day. And it was not any of these immense Aravot. You had little small Aravot, because you weren't going to place them against the sides of the Mizbeach, because if you were outside the Beis HaMikdash, there was no Mizbeach. So you had these small Aravot that we have today, none of these 12-foot giants. And they were carried and waved in some sort of ceremony. Because there was no Mizbeach to go around, so maybe they would have been taken around in a circle, but that's what would have been done outside the Beis HaMikdash during Beis HaMikdash times. I just want to remind you at this point, because we'll need it when we go forward, what was the difference between the Yesod Nevi'im or the Minhag Nevi'im? Two alternative propositions were put forward as to the source of the ceremony of Arava that I've described over here in this box. Outside the Beis HaMikdash. One was that it was a Yesod Nevi'im, and the other it was a Minhag Nevi'im. Yesod Nevi'im, we said, carried greater force than Minhag. Neither of these are Torah values, but they are nevertheless, one is more, has greater chashivut than the other. If it was a Yesod Nevi'im, that means it was a takana, which means the Nevi'im instituted it with the force of a mitzvah drabonon. And they said you had to do it. And under those circumstances, the Gemara suggests that you would have made a bracha. If you were outside the Beis HaMikdash during Beis HaMikdash times, even though it was not halacha l'Moshe Sinai, since you were fulfilling, according to the Yesod Nevi'im ruling, an institution, a decree of the Nevi'im, you would make a bracha, Asher Kedushan Mitzvah Tzavonu, al netilat arava, or al ha'arava, or some variants of bracha. Because it is yesod, it's considered to be like a mitzvah drabona. If you take the view, and this was a machloket, that in fact, that institution was only a minhag nevi'im, it's only a custom, and it was never instituted as a must-do. But people followed it because they thought it was nice to do it, right? It's a nice minhag, you sometimes say about something. And it doesn't have the same level of force. And on that, if you held it was a minhag nevi'im, then you would not make a bracha. The Gemara later on is going to bring you some proofs one way or the other which is going to be based upon whether an individual made a bracha or didn't make a bracha. That itself would declare whether that individual considered it to be a yesod or a minhag. A minhag being something lower would not necessarily carry a bracha. This one day we said was Hoshana Rabbah, small Arava carried and waved. Okay, so that differentiates the outside temple institution of Arava from the inside temple. Inside temple is very different. 7 days, Torah force, these huge Aravot, etc. Okay. After the temple was destroyed, now we're talking about after Churban HaBayis, which includes up to today, but starts already from after 70 in the Common Era, when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So there is no temple anyway, so there's no in-temple. But outside the temple, that means us as well. That means us as well. We actually have a question mark. Why do we carry on this ceremony of Arava? It's not in the Torah. It's not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Nevi'im aren't around anymore who instituted the Yesod or the Minhag. So are we keeping it now as a Yesod or Minhag? So there seem to be three possibilities now. Tear your hair out. Three possibilities. Either we're still keeping it today, we're doing our Hoshana Rabbah ceremony with a bundle of Aravot, because it remains a Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im, just as it was during temple times. In other words, the institution of Arava, which they brought in at the time, was something that they declared should last forever. In which case today we're still under, if you like, the edict of the Yesod Nevi'im or the Minhag Nevi'im, and that's why we do our bundle of Aravot today. Or there's another alternative, it's Zeicha L'Mikdash, in which case we would say that essentially the Yesod or Minhag has expired. The force that is inherent in it being a Tekana of Nevi'im, either that it's Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im, has expired because we're after Churban HaBayis, there are no Nevi'im, there is no Beis HaMikdash, the whole situation has changed. However, we may be doing it today as Zeicha L'Mikdash, as we talked about certain things like this before, commemorating the time of the Beis HaMikdash. We're doing this now as a commemoration event, a souvenir. It doesn't even have the force of Minhag Nevi'im, Yesod Nevi'im. It's certainly not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It has the force of Zeicha L'Mikdash, which brings it down even lower, if you like. That's a possibility, as is Yesod or Minhag. Three possibilities. Well, today we do it for 1 day as well, just as they did outside the Beis HaMikdash in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. And we do this on the 7th day, as we know, Hoshana Rabbah. That's when we take that extra Arava or Arava bunch. We take small Aravot, of course. We're not going to take any 20 feet stuff from Motza outside Yerushalayim. So we take our small Aravot, not the big one. And what's different now, which isn't in any of these boxes, is we now do our beating, don't we? Where does this beating come from? And I put in my boxes over here, later included beating on the ground. How many times you beat it, 3 times, 5 times, 7 times, whatever your minhag has to be. Which today, very often, when we take our Aravot bundle on the 7th day, and we beat it on the ground, we see as being almost the highlight and the main content of the Arava ceremony. Now, this is quite surprising because I never mentioned beating higher up, did I? So how come all of a sudden today, which is after the temple, outside the Beis HaMikdash, there's an extra element? Well, we'll see later on that this comes about because of some doubt as to what a particular Mishnah meant when it said chabita. Chabita can mean waving or can mean bashing. And it's understood that the main force of this idea that we accept the bashing interpretation, which by the way is not what Rashi holds. Rashi does, and Rashi probably never heard of this idea of taking his bundle and thrashing it on the ground. We may enjoy it, it may be our highlight of the whole festival of Sukkot, but he never did it. Because as far as he's concerned, he would take his bundle of Aravot, he would wave them in the air, do some na'anuim, and then put it down and it's all done. This chabita, this beating ceremony, seems to have gathered pace in the Middle Ages and was greatly encouraged with some explanation in the Zohar. So it carries great Kabbalistic force. Now, we all like to be Kabbalists when it comes to doing mysterious things we don't understand. So it's become a bit of a highlight for us to do the bashing on the ground. But in essence, that seems to have been a little bit of a later embellishment. If it was done earlier on, then certainly not everyone did it. Now everyone does it. And I think it's more based upon Kabbalah than it is based on halacha. So that's what we're doing now. And this is an after the temple, if you like, embellishment, you might say, beating it on the ground. If you didn't do the beating, you might still be yotze this institution simply by waving it in the air. Okay, now I hope I've made everything as clear as, or as clear as mud anymore. If you see that there are quite a lot of variations and there's a lot of refinement and detail, then that would justify the fact why you felt so confused with all the Gemaras we've learned in previous weeks. This is a sort of summation of where it all stands. But the Gemara, unfortunately, doesn't do tables for us. I wish it did. You know, I wish the Gemara set out tables. Even Art Scroll doesn't. I've looked at the Art Scroll Gemara. It doesn't do that either. It's been very unhelpful on this whole sugya. Okay, let me go back now, and we can go forward in the Gemara with confidence now, especially now we have this table. And in fact, today's learning is going to be a little bit more peripheral on the Arava, other aspects of this Arava. We're not finished the Arava yet, but it's not going to be very complicated. And I'm going to just quit sharing for the moment, and let's get back to basics.
Well, it has to be a reason for Talmud in Technicolor.
Yes.
So,
well, I didn't do it in color. I should have done it in color. I'm sorry.
Very
yes.
good. Very,
Thank you. This is the real big advantage, actually.
very good. Absolutely.
Of learning on Zoom, actually. If you're learning in person, then you either have to give out lots of sheets or you have to draw all this. I used to draw things on the charts, and it used to take me longer, those charts. It's much easier doing it on Zoom, and I'm not saying that that's the right solution for a shir, but in any case, it's good for those sorts of tables. Let's go on with the Gemara. We are on the top line, actually, of Mem Daled Amud Beis 44b. The last few words, Omer Rebbe Ami, Aleph Reish is Omer Rebbe Ami, the three last words. Aravot Tzricha Shiur. Rebbe Ami, who is an Amor in Eretz Yisrael, is giving us an additional detail. We didn't see this detail in any of the Mishnayos or Breitot that we looked at so far. So he's educating us. And he's saying the Arava that we take today, or the Aravot, if you're taking a bundle, you see there was no number given. We'll see later on the Gemara wants to know how many you need to take. But so far we haven't said anything about 1, 5, 3, elastic band around them, not an elastic band around them, the sorts of things that we so used to on Hoshana Rabbah. None of those details so far have come our way. So we'll have to see them now. So he says, Rabbi Ami, an Arava needs shiur. What does that mean? It means needs to be at least a certain size. A shear means, like you have a shear of matzahs and a shear of yayin, etc. That's what it means over here. You can't just take any old Arava and say this one will do. There are certain requirements. Those requirements may be due, as we'll say later on, to number of Aravot, to size of Aravot, to the number of leaves. Every mitzvah generally has some sort of definition, and everything we have to do is shiur bound, whether it's how much we eat on Kazayas, or whether how much we're not allowed to eat before we're actually transgressing on an Aveira. All our life is measured for us, if you like, halachically. And he doesn't say what the shiur is yet. He just says there is a shiur for the Arava. Ve'eino niteles ela bifnei atzma. And it has to be taken on its own. In other words, you can't take it and wave it together with a Lulav and Esrog, for example, because then you're bundling up two mitzvahs and trying to perform them simultaneously. The Arava, and that's what we do, of course, on Hoshana Rabbah, we take the bunch right at the end, and we do our waving and clapping. So that's what Eino Tenes Elo Bifnei Atzma. It has only to be taken on its own. Ve'ein Adam Yotze Yedei Chavaso Ba'arava Sheba Lulav. And a person does not fulfill his duty of the Arava by the shaking of the Lulav, which itself carries an Arava. So when you shake it, and this is something we saw before as well, some of this is repeated really. When you take your Lulav, and in your Lulav, you have 3 Hadassim and 2 Aravot, you might well say to yourself, well, 2 Aravot, in my mind, one of them is for the Arava ceremony, one of them is for being the Arava in the Lulav, being part of the Lulav bundle. I'm, hey presto, fulfilling both mitzvot. And Rabbi Ami is making clear that's not the case. You need a separate taking of the Arava. By the way, one has to be very careful over here, and the Farshim point this out. When we say here that you're not going to fulfill the mitzvah by the Arava in your Lulav bundle, all he means to say is that while it's in your Lulav bundle and you're shaking the Lulav, then you're not essentially being Mekayim, the separate mitzvah Arava. But should you wish to, and the very, if you like, basic stripped down law, if you were to take an Arava out of the bundle that you had in your Lulav, right? You pluck one of them out and put your Lulav down, you could use that Lulav. That Lulav could be your Arava, that Arava could be your Arava for the Mitzvah of Arava, because that's a separate taking. So you could use the same item for 2 different mitzvah. That wouldn't be a problem. But you cannot use it while it's in the Lulav, because within the Lulav, it's fulfilling the role of Lulav. It's not fulfilling the role of the Arava, which needs to be separate. That's what the Gemara is saying over here. This is a separate ceremony. There's no bundling and bunching and wholesale mechanism which is admissible. Now, Gemara asks a bit of a kasha on this statement, that it seems Rabbi Ami is making one point twice. Given to Amama, since the master has just said, Rabbi Ami, did he not say, Einon iteles ela bifnei atzma, that you can't take, you has to be taken only on its own? It's obvious that if you're taking your Lulav and you're holding the Lulav, that you're not going to fulfill the Mitzvah Arava. You're just going to fulfill the Mitzvah of the Lulav, not the Mitzvah Arava. The two are saying the same thing, isn't it? So if you're saying it has to be taken separately, then we know you can't fulfill the Mitzvah if it's within the Lulav package. It's tautological. Why does Rabbi Ami say the same thing twice in 2 different ways? That's what the Gemara is asking. So the Gemara answers a reason for it. Mahu de Tema, this is something that we also met last time. Mahu de Tema, I might have thought, if we didn't have those 2 separate statements, I might have been under a misapprehension. I might have thought, Hani Mili, when is it not possible to use the Lulav, the Arava within the Lulav to fulfill your Mitzvah of Arava? Only when you only lifted up that Lulav once and you didn't lift it up a second time from the table, if you like. Avol, but I might have wrongly thought, Adbehe, Vahada Adbehe, if he lifted it up for the purpose of the Mitzvah of Lulav, he made his bracha on the Lulav. Then he put the Lulav and esrog down. Then he lifted it up a second time. And he said, I'm doing so now to fulfill the Mitzvah Arava, even though it's within the bundle of the Lulav still. He's too lazy to take it out. It's still in the Lulav, but he now has in his mind that one of the Aravas, if you like, within the Lulav bundle will now be his Mitzvah of Arava Lulav. Why shouldn't that work? I might have thought that would work. Amalo, maybe that wouldn't be forbidden. Maybe that would be fine. Kamash Malam. That's why Rabbi Ami made 2 statements. He's saying, essentially, it has to be taken on its own. And don't think simply by picking up the Lulav a second time that essentially you're doing the same thing, that you are able to focus on the Arava the second time, and therefore as the Mitzvah of the Arava, and you're going to be Makayem, your Mitzvah Arava, you won't be. It doesn't work according to this. And this actually was something we discussed some earlier point. It's not so obvious exactly why, except it doesn't look right, does it? If you want to fulfill the Mitzvah of Arava, and that is a solo mitzvah for the Arava, to say you're doing so by picking up the Lulav, which contains Hadassim, the Lulav itself, and 2 Aravot, to say, well, I'm picking it up really just for the single arava or whatever, or the aravot in the bundle, not for anything else, halachically seems in some ways as being possible, but it's not a nice way of fulfilling the mitzvah. And Rabbi Ami says you don't fulfill it that way at all. If you were to take the arava out of the bundle, that would work. But as long as it's in the bundle, even though you picked it up the second time you had a kavanah for the arava only, that won't work. That's according to the Rabbi Ami. It has to be a separately taken arava. However, the Gemara brings an opinion that argues with this of Rabbi Ami. Rav Chisda Amar, Rabbi Yitzchak, he said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, Adam yotze yedecha vaso ba'arava shebelulav. A person can indeed be yotze, his mitzvah of arava, by picking up the lulav a second time. Interesting. So next time Hoshana Rabbah comes along, if you really want to do something that nobody else is doing, in theory, don't buy your bundle of aravas at all. You have a lulav and esrog, which you use anyway in Hoshana Rabbah. You make your bracha on the lulav and esrog, and maybe later on, when everyone's doing their clapping, all you need to do is pick up your lulav again. No bracha needed at that point in time, just the lulav. Stare at the arava within the lulav and say to yourself, you're doing this l'shem mitzvahs arava, and that's it, finished. Cheaper, no expenditure on your bundle of aravas anymore. What won't you do that way, by the way? What about the beating? You're going to beat your lulav together with it? Well, you don't need the lulav anymore, so maybe you can. This is the last use of the lulav, and I'm almost tempted to say, yes, beat it together with the arava in it. However, remember again that according to Rashi, you don't need to do any beating at all. So to us, it seems like an irony. You could fulfill it with the arava within the lulav. But if all you say you need to do, like Rashi, is to wave it around, all you need to do is pick up your lulav again and wave it around. And you can just laugh at everybody else is doing all this bashing around with their leaves on the floor. Remember, at the end of the day, even though it seems to be the scraped down rule, if you like, how you can just about get away with it. And maybe if you had no other aravas, this would be the thing to do. However, one's not to be perish without sippa. One doesn't want to dafka do things differently to show how unclever one is. One sees this sometimes. There's this old machlokas as to whether one should stand for the aseres hadibros or not. Yes, and I think the Vilna Gaon says you shouldn't, but everybody does. I've been to a shul before where I've seen an individual remain seated where everybody else stands, and he does so dafka to show that he's doing differently because he happens to know what the Vilna Gaon says. Well, a person like that should be thrown out of the shul because he's deliberately making himself different from everyone else. Every now and again in Eretz Yisrael, you find someone who puts his tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Usually it's ignorance. In Eretz Yisrael, I mean, you get malchus if you put tefillin on, not like the Chutz La'aretz, everyone does what they want. But in Eretz Yisrael, the minhag, certainly in Yerushalayim, it's not just a minhag, it's almost, capital punishment. No one puts tefillin on, not at shul. If it's your minhag and you really want to carry it, you do it at home. But sinner, you don't do it publicly. Again, that's deliberately showing yourself off as having some minhag which is more important than joining in the unity of the rest of the kehillah. Okay, so I wouldn't advise you to try and get away from the mitzvah of arava merely by raising your lulav a second time. But according to Rav Chisda, again, this is a machlokes. We just said Rabbi Ami says it doesn't work. According to Rav Chisda, you could do it and say I'm paskening like Rav Chisda, but better not. Now the Gemara is going to ask the question: when Rabbi Ami said that an arava needs a shiur, and in fact, I think everybody would agree that, not just Rabbi Ami, that there has to be some sort of definition of what an arava is. Big, small, leaves, or something. You can't just use the word arava. All our mitzvot are defined. Sometimes they're quantified. It's like people say, why do we get so finicky about things? 3 leaves in a circle. It has to be at least 3 tfachim, whatever it is, a green leaf here and, falling out, and it's a bit dry, not dry. Isn't it the thought that counts? Yeah, this is a universal thing. The Jews are, how many elephants on the eye, in the eye of a needle, etc. Why not? Other religions may say it's not the action, We also say the same. There's a statement, Chazal say, Rachamona libaboy. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants the heart of the Jew, not as much as his action. So why are our actions so deeply and precisely prescribed? Why should they be? If I want to make my arava yellow and purple, and to me it enhances my kavana, why should the halacha tell me that I've got to use a green one, and then it mustn't be more dry, and it mustn't flake off in my fingers? Who needs all that? Isn't it what's in my mind, my heart, and my head, which is more important? This is a question that's often asked of, ritualistic Judaism. We are ritualistic Jews. That's what we are. We perform more rituals than the non-Jews, and that keeps us connected much more than the non-Jews, because you can't connect to something which is entirely ethereal. So that's the way we are. But looking at it from, when I hear this sort of statement from, shall we say, a person who works in a scientific career, a chemist or something, he says, what do you need all this for? Right, long swords. I know what I don't mind using, an esrig, which is actually a watermelon, because I prefer watermelons. You ask him whether he performs his chemistry in the same way, right? Why should I put two hydrogen atoms together with one oxygen atom to make water? Isn't that a bit finicky? Who told me all this detail? Why can't I try one H, and why shouldn't it be HO2, which is hydrogen peroxide? Why shouldn't that be water? For goodness sake, isn't it my mind? Who made these silly rules? One atom of hydrogen with two of oxygen. So it's funny, when we get to self-critique, you can see that it's a stupid argument to say that ritual can be done in any sort of way with no prescription to the detail, because detail is something which is part and parcel of our world. Our telephones don't work without attention to detail, and nor does loading Zoom or anything else. If your password is one little hash out, it's not going to work. And it doesn't make any difference what your kavanah is. So that's the way we are. So the Gemara asks, "V'kama shiura," what should be the shir? And like on everything else, there's a machlokas. So you're all right, when there's a machlokas, you can always follow someone, but you can't make up a third opinion if there are only two opinions. So let's see what the opinions are. So I'm a Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, Shlosha bade alen lachin. 3 moist, what you call them, stalks, branches, whatever you want to call it. 3 moist stalks. Now we have 3 hadassim and 2 arabas and our lulav. And according to this measure, the arava for the arava ceremony needs to consist of 3 stalks, which are moist. And according to another version of this, it should be 3 stalks, which are moist, which have at least 3 rows of leaves on them. Because how long is the stalk? How many leaves does the stalk have? If all the leaves fall off the stalk, is that a stalk? So we're still in trouble. We still need to define to a deeper level what the meaning of the stalk is. But he says 3 stalks, and he says lachin, that they should be, mustn't be dried out. Again, there is a shiur, by the way, for the arava in the lulav. That was also an earlier peirik, how tall it needs to be, how many leaves, what is considered to be cut off at the top. Does it matter if you've lost the top leaves? There's all sorts of instructions. But here we're talking about the aravot of the arava, which, if we look at this prescription over here, it's not going to be precisely the same as what we need for kosher aravot in the lulav. In practice nowadays, we like to treat them the same way, despite the fact, technically, if you were going to look through this Gemara, you'll find you don't need to have quite the same level of hiddur, of beauty in your arava for the bashing bundle. You're going to bash them fairly quickly anyway here. So nevertheless, people try and produce to take a lulav arava that are also nice, of a certain length, moist, etc. So we in practice treat them as seriously as the aravot in the lulav. But that's Rav Nachman, Shlosha bade ale lachin, 3 moist stalks. But Rav Sheshes Amar, Rav Sheshes disagrees, and he says, afilu ola echad uvad echad, which the Gemara is going to deliberately misunderstand in a moment, which is a strange thing to say, but we'll see that in a moment. Rav Sheshes says, 1 it's very strange. Maybe that's why. Read the order. Afilu ola echad, even one leaf, uvad echad, and one stalk. Why not say one stalk and one leaf? Isn't that more logical? And what does it mean, one stalk and one leaf, by the way? Does it mean at least one stalk which has at least one leaf on it? It's quite pathetic, isn't it? Or, as the Gemara is going to deliberately misunderstand, does he mean one stalk and separately a leaf, just a little leaf on its own? Does that make sense? Is that how you would understand it? That according to Rav Sheshes, that he might be saying, all you need is one stalk and a leaf on its own, not attached to a stalk. I would never have cast such an interpretation, but the Gemara does in the very next words. That's why I'm raising it to you. Ola echad, says the Gemara. Do you really mean ola echad vad echad salgadat? But it doesn't matter if you have a stalk with no leaves and a leaf with no stalks. Ella, Ema, you've got to understand what he said. Afilu ola echad bevad echad. Even if you have one stalk and it has only one leaf on it, it's already kosher for an arava, not detached, obviously. But even this is strange, isn't it? Imagine taking for your Hoshana Rabbah, not buying 5, one leaf, one stalk, where you have, or someone has lost all the leaves along it. There's just one leaf left hanging pathetically from the top. It'll be quite easy to bash the leaf off, I can tell you that. People always try to bash as many leaves off. It's like a competition at shul. You should come to shul when people do these things. And it's, it's like at the end, I've got 24 leaves off mine through my thrashing, and someone bigger has managed to get it. But you have to get a very weak Arava bundle where the leaves come off properly. Some people keep bashing until they see leaves come off. Yeah, there are all sorts of different techniques you see in the Arava bashing ceremony, and people have their own minhagim. Most of those are, I was going to say old wives' tales, but I don't think it's appropriate to use that particular expression anymore. Old spouses' tales. So that you need to get so many leaves off and all this. Again, it's probably just a mistake based upon a misunderstanding of the Kabbalah. But according to this, all you need is one stalk and one leaf, and Bob's your uncle, everything's fine. All right. The Gemara ends its description here of size, except I saw that as far as the poskim are concerned, these rather, what should I say, pathetic descriptions of minimum sizes, which may well be the minimum required by halacha, are certainly not what we do today. We nowadays, there's plenty of aravas to find. You find nice aravas, usually they have all the leaves on them. They're really rich and green, and that's what we use today. We don't take this minimalist approach. And possibly, if you were somewhere and there were very few aravot, and you just happen to find circumstantially something like this, it would be useful to know what the minima are. But in practice, that's not something we would follow in halacha. Okay, now the Gemara is going to go right back to discussing, let me just take you back to sharing screen topic. This question again, as to whether Arava outside the Beis HaMikdash was a Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im. You remember I said to you that Yesod Nevi'im carries greater weight, and there you might make a bracha, because it's an institution. Institution, what do you mean? Sorry, I mean more an instruction. A Yesod is more an instruction. So it becomes a mitzvah drabbanan, whereas a minhag is not an instruction. If you have a minhag to do something, it's like you say, I have a family minhag that I make kiddush standing up. Well, that doesn't require you making a bracha for kiddush, but you don't make another bracha because it's your minhag. I mean, that's just the way you do it. I'm being a little bit misleading over here, because a minhag very often carries great force as well. Depends what kind of minhag. Nevertheless, I'm trying to differentiate it from the Yesod, which carries greater force. So let's go on and see what the Gemara makes of this machlokas. Take you back to the machlokas. Stop sharing. Okay. Omar Ivo. Ivo comes in the Gemara several times. He was the father of Rav, the great Amora, who started his learning in Eretz Yisrael and then became the Rosh Yeshiva in Bovel of the great yeshiva in Surah. So he was the really almost a transitional figure was Rav between the Tanoim and the Amoraim. He was in that first generation Amoraim. Ivo, being his father, would have been even earlier than his son. And the Gemara now takes advantage of that historical fact. Amar Ivo once said, Hava ka'imna kame de Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. I was once standing in front of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, and Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok was one of the Tanoim, therefore, who was alive after the Churban Habayis. Don't forget, Rebbe, sometimes seen as being the last Tana. After that, they're Amoraim, and Rebbe was not alive. He never saw the Beis Hamikdash. So with Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok may have been a little bit before Rebbe, and so he was a Tana, but after the Churban. And Ivo said, I was once standing in front of him, and it was Hoshana Rabbah, the Aisu Hahu Gabra Arava Kameh, and a person brought an Arava in front of him. It says one Arava, by the way. So he's going to fulfill, is Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, the mitzvah in the original way, no bundle of 5 as we have today with an elastic band. And he brought an Arava to Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok for him to be able to fulfill his mitzvah. Shokil, he took it, he accepted the Arava, and then chavit. He then, as according to Rashi, he shook it. If you want to say he bashed it on the ground, you can. But I don't think this bashing was really so much enforced. You know, people have imposed the bashing because it's more enjoyable than just waving it around. But he took it and he waved it around, says Rashi. In other words, he fulfilled his mitzvah of Arava, but the lo borich. He never made a bracha prior to taking this Arava. Therefore, says the Gemara, it's clear that at least Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, Kosova, he must have held minhag neviim hu, that it's not a yesod neviim, it is a minhag neviim. As I said, that was a telltale mark. Whether you hold yesod neviim or minhag neviim is how are you going to do the mitzvah? Are you going to make a bracha before it or not? Since Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok made no bracha, he clearly didn't hold this to be an instruction, but rather just a custom, a minhag, and therefore he didn't make a bracha on it. Tosfos actually brings to our attention, all the Mefarshim bring to our attention, that it's not so clear that you don't make a bracha on a minhag. We're taking this almost for granted without argument, that Yesod Nevi'im, there's a bracha. Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok made no bracha, he must hold, it's a minhag Nevi'im. If he'd made a bracha, then that would have proven that it was Yesod Nevi'im. Not necessarily, because as Tosfos points out, that there are some minhagim that you can make a bracha on. The most common one we talk about is we make a bracha on Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. According to the Makar in Halacha, there's no din to say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. It is a minhag, but it's a minhag we make a bracha on. So it is possible even to make a bracha on a minhag. And even though it's not a yesod and it's not a real mitzvah. However, over here, the Gemara is taking a more simplistic point of view, not making differentiation. If it's a yesod, you'd need a bracha. Since he made no bracha, it seems that at least Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok held like the view that it's a minhag and not a yesod. And the Gemara now brings another example of this. Ibu again, the Chizkiah and Chizkiah b'nei Brate de Rav, who were the sons of the daughters of Rav, grandchildren of Rav. So Aisu Arava Lakame de Rav. Doesn't matter who they really are, but they brought an Arava on Hoshana Rabbah in front of Rav. The last case was bringing an Arava in front of Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, who was a Tana. Now we have a case, another story of an Arava being brought in front of Rav, who was one of the earliest Amoraim. And they brought it to him that he should do the mitzvah of Arava. Again, chavit, he did his shakings below Baruch, and he didn't make a bracha. Again, Kosova, it must mean that Rav held minhag neviim hu, that the whole din of Arava is only a minhag neviim. So we brought essentially a number of cases over here in which it's clear that the person performing the mitzvah held it to be a minig neviim and not yesod neviim. We haven't brought any contrary cases, by the way. It does look as though minig is winning out 2-0 at the moment. We haven't brought a contrary case of someone making a bracha, which the Gemara could have declared as proof of someone holding it was yesod neviim. Nevertheless, this is where the Gemara is at this point, on the minig neviim. It's on the minig neviim bandwagon, if you like. Now, the Gemara is going to change the topic completely to one of Shemitah. We're going to move on to Shemitah. Why are we moving on to Shemitah? Because the Gemara has decided to bring together in juxtaposition a number of cases in Talmud where a statement was made by Ivo having witnessed Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Right, the last case we said, or the case we said just before, was Omer Ivo, Imna Kamei Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. I once saw Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. I was with him in the room, and this is what he did. What did he do? He took an Arava, didn't make a bracha, so we know that he must have held it a minig neviim. Now we're going to bring another case of Ivo said, I was once in front of Rabbi Tzadok, and he did X, and it's a completely different halacha. But sometimes we know the Gemara brings cases together, not because they're on the same theme, but because they're brought by the same sage. Yes, so that's fine. You can choose so many ways of connecting. There's so many potential connections between different statements in the Gemara, and this is one based upon person, which means we've got to start to throw ourselves into Hilchos Shemitah. This is not too bad, by the way, but it's a beautiful story as well. So it'll involve a bit of halacha and a story, because there's another eyewitness event of Ivo. Having seen Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, you can imagine that Ivo was doing what might be called today shimush, right? So when a person's learning to be a Rav, he's got smich already, but he wants to spend a couple of years in close proximity in the Beis HaMedrash to a great gadol who is all the time busy giving psak. People come and ask shilas and shuvas, and he watches him at work. So it seems that Ivo was watching Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok at work, and so therefore he has lots of stories to carry. And since Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok was considered to be a Tana as an authority, the eyewitness accounts of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok carry great weight. So let's see what this is about. Omer Ivo, have a imna kamei de Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Then what happened? Asala kamei hahu gavra. A person came before Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok with a shaila, and I was there and I heard it. What was the shaila? Amalei, and he said to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, and this is cute. He says a few nice things, gives him an introduction. He says, Kiriyasa isli. I'm a very wealthy man. This is background. I have villages which belong to me. Kiryat Yovel, Kiryat, the word Kiryat actually means like a little town or a village. Kiryata isli. I actually have kfarim. I have villages that belong to me. I have the land and there are villages there, and all the village owners are on my land. Moreover, Karamaya isli. I have orchards to my name, not just villages, but I have orchards. Zisaya isli, and I have olive groves. Zaitim. I have olive groves which belong to me. And the villagers, they work my fields because they're on my land. They work my fields. And what is happening is this. The Osu B'nai Kiryosa, the villagers, the people who live in those villages, are coming, Umakashkashin B'charmaya, and they are hoeing, H-O-E-I-N-G, good word. They are hoeing the olive, around the olive trees or around the fruit trees that I have, to keep the earth moist and loose. They're hoeing around it. And va'ochlin b'zeisaya, and they're eating the olives as a payment for their work. So they take olives off the trees that they're working on, and that is as a schar avodah. That's the way they get their wages. And then he asks the question, therefore we don't know what on earth the shaila is, so don't be completely flummoxed yet. He asks Rav Elazar Bar Tzadok, Arich o lo arich? It's a strange word. Rashi has to explain where it comes from. Is this appropriate or is this not appropriate? So what's going on over here? First thing, the Gemara hasn't told you yet. Big trick. You won't see it for another 12 lines or so. We're talking about the Shemitah year. You can look at this Gemara for years and not understand what's going on, unless you look ahead, or we look in Rashi, of course, it tells you straight away. This is a Shemitah year, and they're working on the ground around the trees I have on the estate. And they're eating the fruits as reward for their work. Is that, first of all, when he asks, is that appropriate or not appropriate? Is there a real transgression involved over here? I mean, you might think, well, this is terrible. This is a terrible travesty. It's a transgressing of the basic halachas of Shemitah. But as the Gemara is going to show you later on, it's not. It's a Shemitah year, and they're hoeing the ground around the trees. What are they doing? Hoeing the ground around the trees. We'll see later on. In order to make sense of this case, it is taken already for granted, probably by Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, that the hoeing around the trees was not the problem. That under certain circumstances, you can actually do the hoeing around trees to preserve the life of the trees. So even though it looks as though that's the red flag, it's not the red flag. The red flag is that they were eating the olives as a schar for their work. And that looks like schara. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to try and get to grapple with some of the basics. Share screen. Here we are. Just go on. Let's look at the psukim that govern Shemitah. So the first pasuk is by Yadabra Hashem el Moshe Lema. Well, I don't think we need to just make this a bit bigger. The pasuk says, "Dabel b'nei Yisrael ma'ato aleim ki savol haaretz asher nilsen lachem v'shofta haaretz Shabbos laHashem." The land shall observe a Sabbath. Sheish shonim tizra sodecha v'sheish shonim tizmor karmecha v'asaftes tfuasa. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. So what is it that you can't do? It says that you can only plant for 6 years and you can only harvest for 6 years. So as far as the Torah is concerned, the real restrictions are what we would call Zuriya and Katsira, sowing and harvesting. That's what the Torah says. Let's just go on further. Uvashona hashvi is Shabbos Shabboson yehi al haaretz. On that seventh day, you may not do those things. Sodecha lo sizra, no sowing. V'charmecha lo sizmor, and that means really no reaping. Don't pluck off the fruit. Esfiach kitzircha lo siktzar, except if it's hefka. Esfiach kitzircha lo siktzar. There's invein is direcha lo siktzar. Shnas Shabboson yehi al haaretz. And let's look at the next pasuk. V'hoiso Shabbos haaretz. It should be a Shabbos for the land, that 7th year. Lochem la'achla, for you to eat. And Chazal make a gzera over here, a diuk, a deduction. It's for you to eat, not for you to do business with. So if you've got a field and you've got food, you can take the food off. If you allow other people in, they can take the fruit off and they can eat it, but you cannot trade what you take off. In our Torah, you cannot trade. And the Gemara is suggesting at this point that if you understand these laws, then to pay the people who are doing the work, these villagers, for the work they do through eating the olives is a form of payment. It's a quid pro quo. What does trading really mean? You might think trading means just buying and selling. But if you think about it, if a person is doing the job for you and you don't pay him wages, in a sense, by allowing him to eat, you're trading the cash wages you would have given him for the olives that he's now allowed to take. So it looks like trading. Now, the Gemara is the Mefarshim actually say that this isn't real trading, and even this would be allowed. If a person comes in and he just happens to take, and it's hefka, and he takes, if he does some work, but he separately takes, and you're not just saying this is wages. If you were to say to the worker, you may eat the olives, this is wages for your work, that would be a violation of schora, of a sort of business trade. But if all you're doing is letting him work and then letting him eat, and he knows that that's his wages, but you don't specify it, that is not really a violation. So it will turn out in a moment, when we've been through the sugya, that that nothing wrong was done with his land at all. As far as the hoeing was concerned, we're going to prove in a moment that hoeing was mutar. As far as the eating was concerned by the workers on the land, even though it looks a little bit like a violation, it isn't, because he never said to them explicitly, I'm paying you with the olives. So, mitzad hadin, mitzad halacha, nothing wrong. And that's why we'll understand the Gemara. So we go back to the Gemara now. Let's go back to the Gemara. He says to him, arich or lo arich? Why did he ask him arich below arich? Is it appropriate or is it not appropriate? Should he have not asked Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, is it asa or is it mutar? Where have you ever heard this language before? The first time in Shas almost. You find this expression, is it appropriate, not appropriate? You come to a rabbi to ask a shaila. Is it permissible or is it not permissible? So now what I've explained to you, you can see why I asked the shaila this way. Because he knows he hasn't actually done an issa. There's no point in saying is it forbidden or not forbidden, because he knows the halacha. None of this was forbidden. The hoeing was allowed because that hoeing was, we'll see in a moment, was a hoeing to preserve the life of the trees, which is allowed. The workers taking the olives of payment is allowed because it wasn't a direct wage. So that, but you know what? This guy, he wants to go live nimishuras hadin. He doesn't like it to look bad. He comes to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok and he says, I don't feel comfortable. Is it appropriate what I've done or not? That explains the Gemara. And he answers, let's just finish the case. Amalei, Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok said, lo arich. It's not appropriate. So the Gemara goes on with the story. Havakoshavik levazel. He ran off. This guy who came to ask the shaila. He runs off. Why does he run off? We'll see later in the Gemara. Let's just go on and we'll see why he runs off. Amar, Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok said to Ivo, who was with him, he said, what a tzaddik this man is. Akad havesi dayari ba'ara hada arba in shonin. I've already been living in this land for 40 years. I've never seen a person take such an appropriate attitude as this man. He asked me a shaila about what's right, not what is asa or mutar. You see, it's a big difference. He doesn't want to be doing anything even close to sailing to the wind, near the wind. And then Hadava Osi, the man came back. After he'd run off, he came back again and he asked the second shaila for Amalei. And then he asks, my me'avad, what should I do? What would be appropriate to do? And by the way, now we'll see. He's come back now. Why didn't he ask this straight away? What do you mean he runs off? What a strange man this is. This man needs to know what he should do. So why doesn't he wait a minute longer? He's been told it's not appropriate. He should immediately have said, what should I do? But he didn't. He ran off. He came back maybe 2 days later and he says, what should I do? What a strange person. Why does he make 2 journeys? Now you understand why Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok said that he was such a tzaddik. You know why he ran off, the commentators say? He didn't want to lose a minute, even the time to ask the follow-up question. He preferred to rush back and tell those workers, stop eating for the time being. I don't have a heter for you to eat. I'm going to rush back and ask what the alternative is. So he didn't want to be involved with another minute, another olive coming off the tree in an inappropriate fashion, even if it wasn't an issa. In an inappropriate fashion. I understand why. In 40 years, I've never seen a person who's quite so enthusiastic to go lifnim mishurat hadin. Anyway, so what's the answer? So Amalei, so Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok said, you should do it this way. Make an official statement that the olives are hefka, and they're hefka for anyone who wishes to come and take them. And that essentially is the din of Shmitai. right? They're hefker for you as well, but they're hefker for everyone. Then the same pritayu lekashkushe kromim, and also just to be even more lifnim mishirasadin, even though they're hefker and they're taking off and they're eating, pay them for the work of the hoeing that they're doing around the trees in cash, in pritai, in prutus, in cash. So therefore, it doesn't look as though they're gaining some sort of trade advantage by eating of the olives. Make it clear it's hefka and pay them in cash. So he would have gone back and done that. Now, the Gemara is going to go on and discuss whether, in fact, there was an Isser in the hoeing or not, but we've reached 11 o'clock, so I'm not going to go further with this. We'll take it back. But it's a lovely piece of Gemara, and you can see over here, it's a situation, I've seen this in one of the letters as well. Most people go to ask a shayla on something which is it mutter or is it ossa? So he was so surprised, someone's actually coming to him saying, I know everything I'm doing is mutter, but I want to know whether it behoves me to behave this way. And that's why he starts off telling him how wealthy he is, by the way, as well. I have towns and I have people and I have vineyards and I have orchards. In other words, it's no real skin off my back to even pay them in cash. And so Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik will say, a person like you, it's not appropriate. If he'd been a very poor man, the answer might be, well, you're not really doing an Issa, and if this is the only way you can pay them, then let them eat off the olives of the tree in reward, because they're not really being violating any Issa. It's a story which, in the round, actually makes very good sense. I'm going to quit sharing. Second, I've forgotten how to do that. Let me stop recording.